Tom Pendergast was the political machine boss of Kansas City from, it's really in control from 1925 to 1939. But the political machine got its start from Tom's older brother, Jim Pendergast, who came to Kansas City in the 1880s and got started establishing this machine in the first ward of Kansas City, which was in the industrial West Bottoms down by the river. There were many, there was an Irish community, African American communities. It was very diverse, a lot of working class people. And Jim Pendergast had saloons, and he had, he went basically precinct to precinct building this machine that was based on favors, basically helping people get jobs in exchange for votes, helping people through giving them loans that you didn't have to get a formal bank loan, and Jim would loan the money, settling gambling debts, skimming money off at the top of illegal activities such as gambling and prostitution, and so on and so forth. And when Jim Pendergast, he was getting older, his health was failing, and his younger brother, Tom Pendergast, got started in the machine around the 1900s. He was elected city alderman and was in charge of streets for a few years in the early 1900s. And Tom Pendergast really was in a position to take over the machine by the time that Jim died in 1911. And a political machine, it's basically, I started to describe it with the act of doing favors in exchange for votes. I mean, when you boil it down to its base elements, that's what it amounted to. It's being tied into organized crime and other illicit activities, taking bribes and kickbacks, and using influence to make sure that your preferred candidates are elected. And then once you control the city government, by 1925, the Pendergast machine had full control over the city. They had 5 out of 9 city council members who were handpicked by Tom Pendergast. Through the city council, they appointed Henry McElroy, city manager. And the city manager position was really more powerful than any other position in Kansas City at the time. And so Henry McElroy, as manager, was in charge of the day-to-day operations of the city. And reformers had hoped that the manager would be this professional who's kind of just takes care of business in proper ways. But since he was Pendergast's man, it was very improper. And whenever they did city construction projects, McElroy would make sure that these contracts went to companies that were owned by Tom Pendergast. And Pendergast, he owned mostly construction companies. There was basically everything from quarries to cement, there was a ready-mixed cement company, was one of his big ones. He had insurance companies, he had liquor companies, of course, which at least officially they changed to beverage companies during Prohibition at the time. And so all of these city contracts went through McElroy back to Pendergast, and he gets the money. And so there's this circle of money and Pendergast is always getting his cut, and people affiliated with the machine would get their cut, and in exchange he gets lots of votes. On election days they could pay people to vote. They could hire what they called ward healers to go precinct by precinct and intimidate voters from the opposition or bring out their own voters. The election of 1934, for example, there were 4 people killed at the polling sites by Pendergast ward healers. And the way they were able to do this through power and money is they could get away with it because, let's say, after 4 people were killed and 11 were injured, people demanded that the governor call out the National Guard and, come in and reestablish order in Kansas City. Well, who would do that? The governor of Missouri, Guy Park. Well, Park himself was a Pendergast crony. So the power actually went statewide by 1932 when he got Guy Park elected. And they had influence for the state of Missouri, representation at the Democratic National Convention. In the 1930s, Pendergast eventually selected Truman to be senator for Missouri. He was elected in a statewide vote, and but at this point, through Pendergast, I believe the number was that he could produce about 70,000 fraudulent or ghost votes in any given election at this time. And so with that, just the sheer number of votes that he could produce out of Kansas City that would be tallied, and they were official, whether they were real or not. He had the power to do this, and he had plenty of real support. Pendergast machine affiliates could win elections even without stuffing ballot boxes, because they gave people jobs. They built infrastructure throughout the city. They had roads. They had, if you walk around the city today, you can see there's the courthouse still there. Municipal auditorium, 10,000 seats, it's still there. By 1932, it was on top of the world. I mean, he was sending delegates to the Democratic National Convention. He had senators, the governor of Missouri, a big portion of the state legislature. And Pendergast himself had a gambling addiction, specifically in horse racing. So at some point, he racked up several $100,000, and that's 1930s Great Depression era dollars, several $100,000 of gambling debts. And he needed to raise even more money than his corrupt machine could raise to pay off these gambling debts. Eventually, in the late 30s, 1937 and 8, he got involved in an insurance kickback scheme. And actually the scheme, it's not clear whether he broke the law with the scheme itself. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't explain that. But where he really ran into trouble is that he didn't report the income to the IRS for income tax on his tax returns. So just like Al Capone, it was the IRS that finally caught up with Tom Pendergast. And so he was indicted in 1939 and went to jail in Leavenworth, the federal penitentiary. Pendergast was nothing by this point, by 1945. And Pendergast died, natural causes. Truman came to his funeral. I mean, so Truman, who just became vice president, came to the funeral of Tom Pendergast during wartime on a military plane. It's a big controversy. And weeks later, Roosevelt died, and Truman was president of the United States. So Truman could never completely distance himself from his background with the machine, and he owned it. I mean, he said that Pendergast always kept his word, and he wasn't going to abandon his friend. And so what we're trying to do is complicate that history. And I've done a little bit of that in this interview, but we're building a website that will include Currently we have about 9,500 scans of original documents. We have photographs, letters that people have written to one another back then. I mentioned the court cases that unveil voter fraud and other crime. And it's an interactive website that will combine these original documents with new scholarship. So we reached out in 2015 to 18 different professors or other museum professionals or historians who have produced full-length articles that they would go in a book. There's some new ideas in there, or new topics that just haven't been explored in any kind of depth before this. We're taking website versions of those that are a little bit shorter, geared to the public audiences, and those will go on the website. Everything's going to be linked together, so when you're reading the essay, you can click and see the documents that support the research. You can go read the court case that put Pendergast in jail, and it's not as dry as a typical court case might sound when you think about everything that was going on at the time. So we are basically, those are the elements of the website. It will look something like this when the graphics are finished. We have 8 or 9 different categories of topics that we're covering. So there's machine politics, organized crime and reform, economic boom, depression and recovery, Kansas City jazz, prohibition, labor and industry, race relations, communities and neighborhoods, women's rights. Well, we've bitten off a lot, obviously, but the scope is focusing on Pendergast and the machine, and then exploring all of the implications of machine rule in Kansas City, especially in the 1920s and 30s when they were at their peak. So when we look at jazz, we're mostly interested in jazz from the perspective of the machine. How did the machine enable a culture of nightclubs, and people called it the wide open town at the time, that Kansas City was the original Sin City before Vegas, basically. So we're looking at that aspect, where how everything ties together. It makes sense to do this digital platform. You can do a lot of things on a website that you can't do in a book. We're developing ward maps. It's using Google, showing the wards. You'll be able to click and see the first ward, and that's where Tom Pendergast came from. That's where they got their start, and you can see the other machine bosses, and you'll be able to click and go back to the documents, and you'll be able to go from documents to essays, back to maps. There's a timeline. We might be able to create some kind of mind map that shows connections within the machines to kind of visualize in an infographic. It's really difficult to do any of that in a book, in an interactive way that's an immersive experience, and this gives people the opportunity to really learn about the time period.